So in our next unit, we're now into agriculture. And while agriculture may seem very far removed from your daily life, it actually is very integrated, and a lot of the things you interact with come from agriculture. Obviously, all the food that you're eating comes from agriculture, even if it's super highly processed, like some hot Cheetos or something like that. It still came from a farm at some point, but it also provides the cotton in your clothes and so many of the materials that we're interacting with on a daily basis. And conversely, while it's super positive for our lives, it's also can have a very negative effect on the environment. One of the biggest. Agriculture has put a very large strain on our environment. And so that's why it's so important that we work towards sustainable agriculture. That way we don't use up the planet. So this first section is called underpinning agriculture. So they're the things behind agriculture that make it up. So agriculture by definition is the process or the practice of raising crops and livestock for human use and consumption. So animals and plants fall under agriculture. So most of our food and fiber is obtained from cropland. So cropland is the land used to raise crops for human use. And that makes up about 12% of the land on earth, and the other half is rangeland or pasture. And so this is where animals that we harvest in agriculture, livestock, is where they graze, where they live. So, and that takes up about 26% of the planet is cropland. 26% is rangeland, 12% is cropland. This is a little different even in the US. The US, half of the land is devoted to agriculture. So it's a very big part of the US culture and economy. So growing crops and raising animals requires three things. Requires input of several resources. I don't know where I got three from. Soil, on which to grow the crops, sunlight to feed the crops, water to wet the crops, nutrients and pollinators. So even if we're raising animals there still needs to be crops for them to eat. We know nutrients and pollinators are two things you may not have thought of. And today, more than 1 out of every 3 acres of land on Earth is used to produce food and fiber. So a little history about agriculture. So about 10,000 years ago, as the climate warmed and the ice caps started to retreat, many human cultures changed from being hunter-gatherers, so constantly moving to find food, to permanent settlers when they were able to farm, because when they were farming food, they were able to stay in one place. And so the way that we think farming originally started is that hunter-gatherers would find food and bring it back to their encampments where they would live. They would eat it, and then the seeds of these wild fruits, grains, and nuts were unintentionally planted just by falling on the ground, and they started to grow. And this is the first example of artificial selection. So humans would have picked the largest fruits, the ones that tasted the best, the ones that could provide them with the most nutrients, bring them back to their encampments, and then they started growing those ones. So they left behind the ones that didn't taste good. They left behind the ones that didn't provide very, very much nutrients or weren't very large because they didn't pick them. So this is a first example of artificial selection. So they started to breed plants for their desired traits. And eventually humans were able to realize that they could guide evolution, this evolutionary process. And so this is where selective breeding and artificial selection began, when they started to notice this. Archaeologists think that agriculture developed at least 5 times, if not more than 10 distinct times around the planet. So the first accepted domestication, so the first time that we were like, okay, we're sure this happened in the Fertile Crescent over here in the Middle East about more than 10,500 years ago. And what they were growing there were things like wheat and barley, in addition to rye, peas, lentils, onions, garlic, carrots, grapes, and domesticating goats and sheep. So goats and sheep existed, but then they started to domesticate them. And then it happened several other times. And each different instance led to a specialized local crop. So for example, in China, which happened about 1,000 years after the Fertile Crescent, they started to farm rice, millet, and pigs, to domesticate pigs. Then they think that it happened separately in the Africa and the Americas between 4,500 to 7,000 years ago, but maybe as long as 10,000 years ago. And you can see that each of these different regions had its own crops. So the green ones are the for sure independent origins. So we know it evolved independently in Mesoamerica. Central America, now Mexico, in the Andes, so Western South America, and there they were growing llamas and potatoes. We talked about the Fertile Crescent, as well as in China. So we know for sure it happened independently there. And then we think that it may have also evolved independently in these other places, or it spread there, one of the two. So traditionally, agriculture was cultivating, harvesting, and distributing crops using human and animal muscle power. So they would sorry, a few more things to talk about here. So the ancestors here, human ancestors, learned to cultivate crops, which led them to then stay in that one place, which then would lead them to plant more crops because they were staying there. So there's a positive feedback loop that's associated with the development of agriculture. Also, there's a second positive feedback loop where basically as there becomes more food, then there's able to increase the carrying capacity because we removed a limiting resource of food. So now the carrying capacity has increased, so then there's more people to have more agriculture to make more food, so the carrying capacity increases. Also, as there's more food, people don't have to grow their own food anymore. So they are able to grow food for other people. So let's say if you have a neighbor who's able to produce enough food for you, you can do something else and specialize in other things. So this is how human trade started to develop, and not everyone needed to spend all of their days hunting for food. So it led to specialization of different trades developing. Okay, so we have traditional agriculture, which we said is provided by human and animal muscle power. And traditional farmers would only produce enough food for their own subsistence, right? So you're out there working on the land and you are harvesting food to feed your family. Then we start to see industrialized agriculture, which happened through the Industrial Revolution, because it introduced large-scale mechanization, so machines, and using fossil fuel into agriculture. So it not only introduced it into industry, into factories, but also into agriculture. So this could lead to higher rates of irrigation. So we're able to water more land because we can use machines, synthetic fertilizers because we can make fake fertilizers now, and chemical pesticides, which were able to reduce the pests that eat the crops and the weeds that would take over the cropland, also increasing further yield. So another thing that happened is that with the industrialized agriculture, we led to what's called farming of monocultures, which means one crop at a time, and they'll place them in nice orderly rows. This is different than the traditional way that people farmed, which was using polyculture, which would have meant that you had corn here, beans here, rice here, all on the same field. So you're growing many things, that's where the poly comes from, on the same field. So this is, the reason for this shift is because now, since many people are farming and some people are doing other things, I don't have to grow rice, beans, and wheat for my family in order to eat. I can grow beans, my neighbor can grow rice, and the guy down the street can grow corn, and then we can trade them, right? So that can lead to monoculture. And then this led to what's called the Green Revolution, which began around 1950, and this was an intensive cultivation of monocultures using pesticides, irrigation, and chemical fertilizers. And so it introduced new technology, crop varieties, and farming practices to the developing world. So suddenly this helped to increase yields and reduce starvation. So this green here means plants, not necessarily sustainability. Like we talk about green today, like be green means something different. So this was a great thing for the developing world, but it also degraded soil, water supplies, and pollinators. So it had some negative consequences as well. So we need to be talking about sustainable agriculture. That way we can continue to feed ourselves for the rest of the history of the rest of the human race. So sustainable agriculture needs to sustain the resources that require to do agriculture. So it maintains a healthy soil. That way we don't over-farm and we can continue to use the soil. Clean water. That way we have water to water the plants. We need to protect our pollinators. This is why bees become so important. And there's also tons of other kinds of pollinators and other vital resources. So the overall approach for sustainable farming or sustainable agriculture is to mimic the way natural ecosystems function. So we don't want to have artificial ecosystems around our farming. We want to mimic the way that the crops have always grown, while using our technology to make better, healthier, more food to sustain the planet. So in order to do this, we need to understand the way soil, water, nutrients, and pollinators interact and underpin agriculture. That way we can understand how to make it sustainable.